Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Charts Evergreen Hearts, with Stephanie D.H. Evergreen. We're excited to have you join us today. My name is Sherry Countryman, and I'm the Executive Marketing Manager for the Research Methods, Statistics, and Evaluation list at Sage Publishing. I'll be your moderator today. Please take a minute and make sure that you're all set up. If you have any technical issues, you can pose a question in the Q&A box to the right side of your screen. I'd like to begin today with a few polls, just to help us get to know you a little bit better. Our first poll asks you to share your current position working with data visualization. Are you an instructor, a student, or a researcher or practitioner? Go ahead and select one. We'll give you a few more seconds to respond. See, a good number of researchers and practitioners. And then some students, great to have you join us, and instructors as well. Terrific, welcome everyone. And then one more question for you today. What's your comfort level in working with data visualization? Are you a beginner, seasoned pro? Let us know. We'll give you a few more seconds to respond. All right, a mix of comfort levels. Well, great. What a treat today to have you join us. I think everyone will get a lot out of this webinar. We're really excited to have Stephanie join us today. So let me begin by introducing you to our speaker. Dr. Stephanie Evergreen is a sought-after speaker, designer, and researcher, known for bringing a research-based approach to helping others better communicate their work through more effective graphs, slides, and reports. Dr. Evergreen has trained audiences worldwide through keynote presentations and workshops for clients such as Facebook, MasterCard, Verizon, and the United Nations. Dr. Evergreen is also the author of 3 titles with Sage Publishing: Presenting Data Effectively, Communicating Your Findings for Maximum Impact, 2nd edition, and then her most recent publications, Effective Data Visualization, The Right Chart for the Right Data, 2nd edition, and the Data Visualization Sketchbook, which offers advice for getting started with sketching and provides tips, guidance, and complete sample sketches for a number of reporting formats. You can also read Stephanie's popular blog on data presentation at stephanieevergreen.com. Now, just a few logistical issues. This 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view the webinar recording and all the slides that you'll see today in the coming days, so that'll be available for you. If any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please just use that Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you as soon as possible. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time for Q&A from all of you, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions, and Dr. Evergreen will be happy to try to address them, as many as possible. You'll also want to make note of the webinar hashtag SageTalks, where you can also ask questions or leave comments. So without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Stephanie Evergreen.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm so glad to be here with you all today. We're going to be highlighting Charts I Heart from 2 of my latest books that Sherry just mentioned. And at the end of the webinar, Sherry is going to give you a discount code for 20% off of these, which is so great. So I'm actually going to walk you through charts that I don't heart at all, and the stuff that I would recommend that we use instead because of its amazing storytelling power and because there is research that backs up why it's such a good choice. So in effective data visualization, the chapters are broken out by the nature of your data. So we're going to start with one of those early chapters, which is when a single number is important. And I'm telling you right now, it can be a little hard to love this one because oftentimes what I see is stuff like this, and it breaks my heart. We see this all the time. I think everybody's new favorite thing is an infographic called By the Numbers, or in like every magazine, you'll see something called like Stats or By the Numbers in it. And it's just a lot of numbers in maybe a big font. Perhaps there's an icon associated with, perhaps there isn't. But none of these are really doing it because our brains are limited to how much information we can process at once. The research that we have on working memory tells us that people can really only juggle 3 to 5 chunks of information at one time. And when we just show a bunch of random numbers, it's a lot of chunks, and that makes it really hard for anybody to retain any of these. This is one of the reasons why tables are so hard for people to process. It's because it's so many different chunks. And when we basically just put a table in bigger fonts and add some colors, it's still just a table, and it's very hard for us to process. So what do we do instead? Let me give you some other options here. So showing just one number, just one by itself, could completely be okay. I used to think this wasn't even an option for us, but I'm a PhD. I listen to the research, and you should too. The research here I saw was a study that came out of Michigan State University, and it was a really simple study setup. They just wanted the study participants to remember a number. So a random third of them saw it as a single number like this. Another random third got it in a bar chart with that bar like really emphasized, and another random third got it in a pie chart with that pie wedge really emphasized. And then they came back a couple days later to the study participants and they said, remember that chart we showed you? What was the number? And the people who just saw the number were the ones who were most likely to remember it a couple of days later. So what's the difference between this and all those by the numbers graphics I just showed you? Well, the critical difference is that there's only one number, just one by itself. If you just use one number by itself in a nice big font, maybe even with the color on it, that's going to stick in people's heads. But as soon as we start getting beyond this one, it kind of dilutes the power of that single big number. So it would be perfectly fine to use this if you just use it like one time per infographic, per slideshow, per report, whatever. You just want to save this for like that one big stat you're trying to communicate. Which means we do need to have other options because you'll have more numbers that you need to get across. And this is a perfectly fine time to use something like a donut or a pie. Even though the research around graph types tells us that people aren't very good at interpreting things like curvature, this isn't a pop quiz of how many degrees of curve are in my donut, because my number is right there. It's just a little bit of wrapping paper. It's a little bit of eye candy. Now, I just told you about that Michigan State study that said this isn't going to perform as well as a number by itself, but you have to do other things. So it would be perfectly fine to use something like this. When we wrap a little bit of a visual around that number, it just makes for a bit quicker mental processing. Other options we have here. How about an icon array? I'm sure you've seen these before too. They're popular in infographics where you'll see like a row of 10 or maybe 100 shapes, usually with a color to indicate what that big number is. Also something I thought tended to be a little bit too, immature, maybe that's the word for it, until I saw the research. And this study that I'm going to tell you about was published in a medical journal where they used patients in a hospital, so just like regular folks like you and me. And their job was to read this long, complicated math story problem and just solve it. The story problem itself was printed in the journal article, and I'm telling you, I'm a PhD. It was hard to get through that story problem. But their experiment showed that the people who were best able to generate the answer were the ones who got the data paired with an icon array, and that it gave the biggest boost to those folks who had low number literacy skills. The high number literacy folks also got a boost, but we saw the biggest boost in this low number literacy group, and I think oftentimes that is part of our audience. So I do think that these icon arrays have a role in our reporting. However, I think we need to be careful about our choice of icon. Sometimes I see people undercut their professionalism by choosing cheesy icons, so let's stay away from that. I have seen some research that shows when we use the little like stick figure dudes, people donate more money. Like this was a study conducted in an international development fundraising context, and they showed that the little dudes kind of create some kind of connection, I guess, to the audience, and they give more money. However, those are dudes. Somebody woke me up to this fact. I was using those little dudes to represent like everybody in my study population as well for the longest time until somebody pointed out that they're male. And I know this because every place I go in the world, there is a different icon on my bathroom door. That male is also able-bodied because culturally we have agreed upon separate icons for people who are not able-bodied. There are actually a lot of values in that generic dude we thought was representing everybody, when it's probably not representing your entire study population. So I think we have to be careful. I stick to abstract shapes. I have seen people try to switch it up. So it'll be like one dude, one in a skirt, one dude, one in a skirt. But humans are natural meaning makers. We seek meaning, and people will read into stuff and make meaning out of it, even when you didn't intend it to be. So by changing up the icon, whether it's like a dude or a woman, people will take that to heart and think that, 50% of your study population are male and 50% are female. So I just don't want to over-assign any kind of meaning to this stuff. I stick to circles, I stick to squares. Of course, you could choose a more relevant shape. So here is my heart chart icon array, which is a hint about the contest we are going to announce at the end of the webinar. Another chapter in the book is how two numbers are alike or not. So let's talk about some of the options here. The most common way I see people convey data like this would be a bar chart or a column chart. And it's okay, like I don't love it, but the research shows that people are good at judging length, so this would make a bar chart or a column chart easy to read. However, the research also says we're bad at comparing non-adjacent lengths. So we wanted people to compare a bar that's all the way on the left to a bar that's all the way on the right. It's really too far for their brains to have to travel back and forth to try to match up and compare those data points. People are really only limited in bar charts and column charts to comparing the stuff that is chilling out right next to each other. So there are some limitations here. Let me give you an alternative. This is a dot plot, and it might be my favorite chart type of all time. Dot plots encode the data by the dot's position or location along a scale. These are really handy because when we look at the research about how people interpret charts, position is actually at the very top of the list. It's the easiest way, the most accurate way for people to read data. Now, it's not a typical chart type, so people who work in Excel a lot get uncomfortable when they see these because it's like not a chart that's familiar. You don't know what button to push to make one. But what we find in practice is that the people who are not Excel nerds making charts all day love these things because they're just so instantly recognizable. Dot plots are also great because they help us condense more data into a smaller space without making it feel really cluttery. Like if each one of these data points was a bar, this chart would have to be twice as long as it is. But because we're collapsing multiple points per line, we're getting more data into a smaller space. You could even have more than 2 dots, 3 or 4 per line, kind of depending just on how your data is going to shake out. Your labels can be in near the dots like I have them here, or they can be out to the left like you might traditionally see. Either way would be perfectly fine. Let me give you some cousins to this. This is a dumbbell dot plot, another chart that I heart. This is probably the #1 graph type I implement with the companies that I consult with. Because dumbbell dots have a distinguishing feature here, which is the line that connects the two dots, like a little tiny Popeye dumbbell. And the line emphasizes the distance between the two dots. So this is the chart type to use if you are trying to tell a story about the distance or the gap or the disparity. And that's why I end up using this chart so often with my clients, because we're all trying to tell stories about gap or distance or disparity. So dumbbell dot plots are a very handy chart type to know about. I'm going to give you another cousin to the dot plot. You don't have to have two. You could just have like one dot in your chart with a stick, and that would be a lollipop graph. Now, my lollipop graph here has, instead of lollipop heads being circles, it has hearts, because we're here to talk about charts I heart, and this is going to be another hint as to the contest we're going to reveal at the end of the webinar today. So lollipops can take on shapes for their lollipop heads if your audience needs to be engaged in that kind of a way. Traditionally, I would just make mine as circles, but it depends on the group you're talking to, right? Like I was working with the New York City Department of Health, so we made our lollipops with little apples up there for icons because, you know, they're the big apple. So it's going to land with that kind of an audience. I'm going to move on to a different chart type here that people tend to love or hate. I don't know where you feel about how you feel about tree maps. Folks tend to have polar feelings about them. Love them, hate them. Very few people are in the middle. If they are in the middle, it's because they just don't really know what they're about yet. So let me explain a tree map to you, and maybe you'll be convinced that you should try it. So tree maps work when we're trying to tell a story about a hierarchy, when we're talking about like parts of a whole of parts of a whole. You can kind of think about it as a square pie with just more layers on it. So let me give you the story about this one. So Corey represents the entire rectangular area here. Corey oversees Mary and Peter. You can see their names in those gray boxes up at the top there. And I think this example was about sales volume. So we can tell already that Mary's team sold more than Peter's team because Mary's portion of that rectangle is so much bigger than Peter's. And then we see the actual sales volumes for everybody on Mary's team and everybody on Peter's team. So it's giving us like kind of a square pie with parts of a whole inside parts of a whole. We get this story of hierarchy in here. However, tree maps are area. An area is not a chart type that our brains read very easily. If I didn't have the dollar amounts on here, it would be pretty difficult for people to compare Scott's sales to Damien's sales because their squares don't take up the same ratio. They're not the same proportion. So it would be very difficult to compare these things. So when you have tree maps, you really do need to have the data labels on each one. I'm going to show you one that I saw out there in the wild and ask you to answer this question. You might have to type it into your questions box, but that's okay. I want you to tell me, look at the tree map here. This is when things get kind of complicated, don't they? And tell me the answer to the question up at the top. Who has contributed the most to global CO2 emissions? Type your guess. It's okay if you type it into your questions box. I know I'm seeing a lot of answers come in here, and some people are even changing their mind a little bit, right? Because once you look a little bit deeper, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I guess that's not exactly what I'm looking at here. So it is actually Europe, yes. When we're talking about the overall like continent, the yellow area is the biggest. Now, if you look at individual country, yes, it's going to be the USA. You've got that right for sure. But what could we do? What could the designers of this have done to make it seem like Europe was more immediately the correct answer? Yeah, I'm seeing, yeah, you already kind of know some of this intuitively. We would put that data in the upper left.
Stephanie, you may have muted yourself. We're not hearing you. Thanks for your patience, everyone. We'll get Stephanie back on the line shortly. Thanks for your patience. We're working on getting Stephanie back on the line shortly.
Hey, I think I'm back. Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yep, you're back.
Awesome. Great. GoToWebinar hung up on me. I guess they don't like tree maps either, but I'm going to come back and talk about them anyway. So yeah, you all were correct. You would move the Europe data to the upper left. We live, or at least I live, in a culture that reads from top to bottom, left to right. So we would want to begin in the upper left. We want to put the stuff that was the most in that area and move other things around. And it can be a little hard for people to tell that North America and Asia are the exact same because the proportion of the green area to the red area are not the same. And you can see where things get difficult in here, right? Because these little tiny ones, we have no idea. There's no way of even knowing what those countries are. So tree maps have their drawbacks. I tend to not use them when I have a lot of little tiny categories that nobody's ever even going to be able to read. So they work best when you have like more categories than you'd want to put into a pie, and you have this parts of a whole, especially if none of the categories are going to be super tiny. So things like demographics or budgets tend to work well in tree maps. Awesome. Okay, thanks for sticking with me through that. Yes. So far we've been talking a lot about quantitative examples, but what we know when we look at the research on persuasion is that people need more than that. They need their logic to be spoken to, and they need their emotions to be spoken to. And logic tends to be the quant stuff, although sometimes, for sure, quant can be emotional. But qualitative data is another good method to reach people's emotions to help tell stories. So let's talk about some qualitative options. And before I forget, I have a little qualitative chart chooser that I'm going to send out that you should be able to access now or when the webinar is over. So you should be able to see that like in a chat box or something showing up on your screen. There are lots and lots of options on that qualitative chart chooser. And I'm going to walk you through some of them right now. So we always argue here at Evergreen Data that about whether time is quant or qual. But here we are, so we're going to talk about it anyway. And I'll tell you, this is a timeline I do not love because timelines are based in data and they need to be proportionate. Just like we would expect a bar chart to be proportionate, a timeline needs to be proportionate. Somebody sent me this one that came from one of my elected representatives who tweeted this one out. Do you see any issues in here where the timeline is not exactly proportionate? I do. Let me spot it out for you here. So we start the timeline in January 2011, exactly, and then we leap, like time travel, 5.5 years into the future to get to June 24th, 2016 in the span of about an inch, right? And then about that same amount of distance, I'm glad that somebody pointed this out in the chat. Sarah pointed out, we've got December 2nd all the way over on the right and December 4th, about the same distance away from each other. It's just 2 days. That is a disproportionate timeline, and it's not going to work. Timelines have to be proportionate. timelines can get really complicated and they can get very cluttery and kind of tricky to read. So it would be much better if we can use things like proportionate timelines and nice colors and making the visual as clutter-free as possible. And then it is so pretty, right, William? I know. Then the kicker here is to repeat that little portion of the timeline over in the margins when you're going to go into detail about whatever that activity is. That way people can connect this bigger explanation back to the original timeline diagram that you showed people in the first place. That's how you make a timeline really work. I know, Kathy, I love it too. A more elaborate timeline would be a journey map. It's definitely more involved, right? So let me talk you through the backstory on this one here. This one was designed by the Smithsonian Office of Visitor Studies. They had done some qualitative observational studies about the patrons that visited the museum. And what they found was that when people showed up to the Smithsonian, they were like already angry. They were hot because DC is just grossly hot in the summer. They had been confused and frustrated by the metro and how to get there. When they showed up, there were like multiple desks to approach. They didn't know where to go. They were just getting confused. So the director of this office went to the board and asked for money to do something about this, to create some kind of intervention, and they said no. So he then plotted the information out into a journey map that kind of like plots out where they have potential touch points with their museum patrons. And everything that's in the blue on the left and the right was stuff that they did not believe they had control over. They were touch points, places where a consumer was going to connect to the Smithsonian, but they didn't think they had any kind of control over those things. So once he drew this all out into the journey map, he took this back to the board and showed them like, hey, so there's all these opportunities happening before people arrive, like marketing that we're doing and some resources that we're doing. And even like the metro signs in DC, as people physically get closer, there are all these touch points they have with us. And they come inside the museum, there are all these things that they do. Then when they leave and they go back out into the world, there are all these other potential touch points. And once he drew it out into this journey map, the board gave him a bunch of funding, and he launched what's now this like award-winning website. I think it's called something like My Trip, that helps you plan out your trip, anticipate what the metro is going to be like, how hot it's going to be, and all of that. So it helped them reach some of these touch points that they didn't have before. This is just one cool way to use a journey map. There are many others, and we have some examples on my website. When you go there and you just search on journey map, you'll see them. Let me give you yet another qualitative example. This one's called a spectrum display. And I found this in like a journal article that was published in 1980, and it kind of looks like that, right? I know. So this one was a observational study of a library, a public library that had a computer lab installed. Remember like back in the late 80s when we started to get computers in our libraries? Well, they wanted to know what people were doing on those computers, so they observed. And the way that they plotted this out in the journey map, in the middle here, we have these mutually exclusive sections that break out how long the person spent on the computer. Then the rings are the themes of the study, or essentially the things that people did: sign up and pay bills, search and browse, look for jobs, email, etc. And then coming in from the outside, we have all the individual library patrons. So patron 4 was there for less than 16 minutes and spent that time emailing. So it's a really cool way to show a lot of observational data in what would otherwise typically just be like case study after case study after case study after case study. And those stories are great, but you can only have so many before people are like, I am not going to read this anymore. We need to summarize some of that data up into visuals, and a spectrum display is one cool way to do it. So let me give you the anatomy diagram for the spectrum display. You're going to have your mutually exclusive variable kind of breaking out the sections that are happening in the middle. Your individual cases will come in from around the outside, and then your themes will be the rings. Now, it can get kind of complicated. I completely agree. So it would be okay to break it out into multiple visuals if you needed to. And then we might add in some icons and some color coding. We'll add in insightful titles. Maybe we'll pair it with a quote. so that it isn't just more words, but the words are supporting some kind of bigger visual. Spectrum displays are cool and they're new for most of us. So we're going to do a very quick little sketch activity for this right now. Grab some paper and pencil nearby. You're going to code the clothing of those in the room with you, or if you're not in the room with anybody, of your family this morning when you were home, or your friends last night or whatever. Think about a group you saw lately and you're going to code their clothing, okay? So here's how it goes. First, you draw an upside down Pac-Man. So sketch that out. Then you're going to draw another little Pac-Man inside to make one ring, and you're going to label that their tops. Then you're going to draw another little Pac-Man ring inside that and label that their bottoms. We're talking about clothing here. Keep it clean. Okay, then we're not gonna deal with any kind of mutually exclusive variable in the middle. We're gonna disregard that for now for simplicity's sake, but you're gonna need to break your spectrum display out into however many people are in the room with you or are in your family or were hanging out with you last night or whatever, and then give them all numbers. Then you're going to assign a color coding scheme here, where you might have like an open circle if it was a long and a closed circle if it was a short. They don't necessarily have to be circles if you didn't want to. You could always turn them into hearts, since we are talking about charts I heart. And then you'll just fill in your spectrum display so that like if you were wearing a short sleeve shirt, you'd have a filled heart. And if you were wearing long pants, you'd have an open heart, and you would code every single person that is in the room with you. This one is another hint about the contest that we're going to announce at the end of the webinar. Awesome. Okay, so more qualitative options for us here. This is one that the quant people tend to hate. They're the ones who think this is breaking my heart. We're talking about a speedometer here. They say, this takes up so much space. What a waste of space. We should just unwrap these things and make them linear, make them vertical or horizontal, and it would be a much more condensed visual. Okay, sure, but I love these because I think, first of all, in qualitative land, we need visuals that take up a lot of space. But second of all, sometimes this is exactly what matches our story. Let me give you an example. So when we, in the culture that we're in right now, we tend to read left to right. So when we see stuff like in a bar chart, we think 0 starts on the left, and as we move toward the right, we're improving. That left to right always means progress. That going backward would be moving to the left. But what if moving to the left is not necessarily a bad thing? What if we need to show that we're kind of like impartial? We don't want people to be thinking left to right means progress. Well, if we bend this linear thing into a curve, we kind of break people's mental connections with left to right always meaning progress toward better. So sometimes this is exactly the thing that makes the most sense. It would be a speedometer graph. I'll give you another example of one, though. This is also a good example for us to use when both ends of our scale are not ideal. For example, this was a visual that was used on based on a jail program that was aimed at building independence. They were about to release these people back out into the community, and they wanted them to have independent living skills. So they had classes on this stuff, and the people that were in the program in the jail were all surveyed at the end. And this is the case where they don't want stuff that's not helpful at all, of course, but we don't really want stuff that's too helpful or overly helpful either, because we're trying to build independence here, right? So when our sweet spot is kind of in the middle, a speedometer graph is the way that we can show that information. Of course, I want to have an awesome title. Maybe we would pair it with some quotes to help illustrate what we mean by too helpful. We might even add in some action colors in here to really pop out the story. Okay. So Chapter 8 of Effective Data Visualization has even more options. It's actually the largest compendium of qualitative data visualization options that are out there today. And in the Data Viz checklist, the updated qualitative chart chooser is in the back cover, and the quantitative chart chooser is in the front cover, so you get all of those things with you. So the sketchbook takes us from just thinking about graphs to putting together entire reporting mechanisms like infographics, or I actually prefer to call them handouts because I feel like infographics have kind of gotten a bad name at this point. Here's one that I made a long time ago. Gosh, it feels like it was ages ago. And I was kind of overdoing the single big number. Don't you think? I know, I was just starting to figure this stuff out, but putting it in a big number does not make these things memorable. Here's a more updated version of my personal infographic. I couldn't entirely get away from big number. I actually think that visualizing a bunch of big numbers is one of the hardest things that we have to do. But it's doing better at telling the story because I added in more words. And I think that's often what we need, that when we make infographics and things like by the numbers and we're just puking out big numbers at people, they don't weave together into a story. But we need helper language in there. We need sentences that tie one metric to another and tell us how all these things fit together into one big picture. So I'm definitely making progress here. I'll show you, I want to point out that we read top to bottom, left to right. So I have something up here to catch your eye, and I have something down here to kind of leave you with, you know? Here's another one that came from some clients. We made this for them. And this one's also on my website. I wanted to point this one out to you because I hear people ask me questions about this all the time, which is, how do I talk about things like odds ratios, like really complicated stuff? This was an example of how we did that, where we used a lot of great visualizations, tried to limit the use of single big number, and we have this big fact check box in the upper left and 4 more go-to and their logo down in the lower right. So those things will help anchor your overall infographic or handout. Now I want to show you the makeover of one handout to kind of give you an idea about how we can do a better job of telling our story. This is the original. Looks like it came straight out of Microsoft Word, don't you think? And these poor people who work so hard in this nonprofit, and we're just trying to talk about the people that they serve, using the tools that they have, which is Microsoft. I helped make this over for them, and we still kept it entirely inside the Microsoft Office software suite because you need to know how to use the tools that you already have, right? So the way that we told this story was that we started off by thinking about the words, those helper sentences that will give us some insights about what's going on. So we just started up at the top and thought, okay, what would be the best helper sentence here? And I'll show you what we did. We went with, this year, we served over 2,000 families. Let us tell you a little bit something about them. I love that. That draws me in. That makes me think that you're excited about where you work, whereas families served in FY16 feels like I'm being punished a little bit, you know? So we went down to the demographics here, and they are talking about gender, even though there is no title that says so. And we said our clients are 95% female head of household. That's an insight that you're not going to easily glean just by looking at the numbers there. Then I went down to the data on race ethnicity and said our clients are mainly Black African American. Then I looked at the age data and I said we generally serve adults under 30 with children under the age of 1. All that information is there in the original. It's just not clear to the audience. And that's the kind of processing and translating that we have to do to tell a story. I kept the education data in here and just said most adults have a high school diploma or less. Now, even if you just saw these titles, you would have a pretty good picture of who they serve. Then we went back up to the top and said, okay, what kind of visualizations could we make that would support the interpretation of this data? Big person in a skirt, tiny dude is not going to cut it. So we turn these into stacked bars. And when you put those stacked bars next to each other, the disproportionate amount of female head of household is striking. You can also see that I've started to do some color coding by group in here as well. Then we regraphed that race data. So initially it was columns. You can see those columns here. Bars are the ones that go side to side. Columns are the ones that go up and down. And the reason that I turned them 90 degrees to make them into bars was because these labels were getting to be a hot mess. When you make a column chart and your label starts wrapping down onto 3, 4, or 5 lines, that's your sign, that's your signal that you need to just rotate the whole thing 90 degrees and make it into a bar chart so that your labels will lay out on one horizontal line and be easy to read. I also put them on the same scale because look at this on the left here, 55%. This one on the right that looks smaller is actually larger. So I put them on the same scale here. The ethnicity donuts that were different sizes, we again put into the same scale. And then the age data, it was a bar on the left. I kept it as a bar on the right. But for children on the left there, it's a pie. And using two different chart types when the data is the same, when it's both age, doesn't make sense. So I kept that, I turned that into a bar as well. And then I put them on the same scale because it's the same data. I liked their little icons for education, so I kept those. I just used some better color coding in here to make it clear. Now, this was one internal page of a report. If I wanted this to double as a one-page handout, I would have needed to go a little bit further. I would have needed to add some kind of call to action in the lower right. Now that you know all this great stuff about the people we serve, do you want to volunteer? Do you want to donate? Do you want to call your state rep and advocate for us? It doesn't matter what you say in your call to action, but there should be something in the lower right if this is going to stand on its own. So I just walked you through an example here, but laying out all these different chart elements on a handout or a dashboard is definitely tricky. It's like you might feel like you're pretty strong at graphing and data visualization, but page layout, like that's graphic design. That's like a totally different ballpark, right? The easiest way to figure out what should go where is to sketch it first. Sketching saves you so much time because you can whip out a little chicken scratch sketch in 5 seconds versus having to make everything by hand on your computer screen and then undoing it and then rearranging it. Whereas you can just use your eraser and move things around in your sketch. What we see from the research on sketching is that it makes the whole development process faster with a cleaner result and fewer errors along the way because you tend to catch your errors when you're sketching it out versus when you're just making some diagrams with your computer staring at you in the face. So in this sketchbook, we give you templates to sketch within so that you have a built structure ready to go. And this is what will make life so much easier so that when you do open your computer to make your handout, you know exactly what's going to go where. You know exactly what you're looking for. The structure that you're looking at here for Handout Helper C is the what, so what, now what structure. And that's generally a good order to go about telling your story because that's the order your audience is going to have for their questions. They want to know from you what, so what, and then now what. The blog post that I put out today on my website talks about this what, so what, now what structure in more detail. We have even more templates for you in the sketchbook where we are giving you structures you can use for your slides and for your dashboards and for your reports. And then effective data visualization is where you'll see the step-by-step directions on how to make all of this stuff inside Excel. I see a question in here already from Keo that says, since Excel doesn't do many of these and we're going to record scratch and stop right there, everything I showed you today I made inside Excel, everything. And the step-by-step directions on how to do it are in this book. It'll tell you exactly how to set up your tables and exactly what buttons you have to push. Sure, you're going to have to hack the chart types, a dot plot, out of an existing default chart that's in Excel. Sure, but it can do all of them. And speaking of questions, let's get more of them. We'll turn things over to Sherry to moderate.
Wow, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that great presentation. So much great information. Our audience, I'm sure, is anxious to ask you some questions. So let's spend a few minutes doing that. Please continue to send in your questions using the question box on the right side of the screen, or you can send them in via Twitter using hashtag SageTalks. And we'll see, we'll give Stephanie a few minutes to respond to your questions. One that I caught early on in the webinar, Stephanie, was a question for you about would you ever use squares or diamonds instead of circles for dot plots or other types of charts?
Sure, I absolutely think you could. You could change up the shape. If you didn't want to use a circle, I used hearts in one of mine. You could completely change it up. Circles tend to be the cleanest, and they also give you, and squares too, would give you enough real estate where if you wanted to put your data label right inside the dot, you could. Triangles are going to make that a little bit harder because they just don't have enough room to hold your entire number label in there. But if you weren't using number labels and you're using an axis and grid lines, you could certainly get away with that.
Great. Here's another one that came in. What is the typical turnaround time for a one-page public-facing infographic? Probably depends on
That's a great
experience
question.
level.
It does, yeah. It was like, are you hiring me or are you hiring
Right.
like your neighbor? It'll be different. But the thing about it that takes the longest, in my experience, making one pagers with people, is when folks don't have their insights figured out yet. That's the first step. And the person who's going to be in the best position to figure out those insights is you, the person who's working on the program, who knows the data, who owns the data. You have to start with your insights. Then you can always hire a graphic designer or a data visualization wizard to make the graphs for you that support those insights. But insights have to come first. And that's usually the hardest, most time consuming part because you got to really be sitting there thinking about your data.
And then we had another question, your favorite font or typeface?
Well, it depends on where this is going. So there are three kinds of typefaces, three general ones out there, and they all kind of have a different best home. So what you see on the screen here is going to be a sans serif font. Sans serif is Latin. It means no little feet. And when you look at these letters that you see on my screen, you're going to see that there are no little feet at the ends of letters. They just kind of cut cleanly off, like at the ends of the eyes. And that is the best kind of font to use for stuff that's on the screen because they tend to be like really thick letters, like the lines are nice and thick and bold and easy to see when they're electronically projected. That's also the same kind of thing you'd want to use for headings in your handouts or in your reports. But for the long narrative paragraph stuff, that's not what you want. You want to have a serif, the kind that have little feet. The one you probably know the best is Times New Roman. And the research that we see on reading is that the serif makes for the fastest reading for average readers because those little feet help create this almost continual line along the bottom of your sentences that just makes reading go faster. When it comes to data visualization, you don't want to have a serif. You don't want to have little feet on it because that would just be some extra unnecessary clutter. You'd want to be using a sans serif, but you need a sans serif that's condensed. Something that's going to be tall and skinny. Because when we're talking about data visualizations, we don't have a lot of real estate for those words. So we're going to have to squeeze more into smaller spaces, and that's what a condensed font is going to help you do.
Great. How about your preferred application for creating online data visualizations?
Yeah, so there is a little bit that you can do with Excel 365, but I'm telling you, it's got so many limitations. I do not like using that if my stuff has to go online. Like if it's, let me say this in a different way. If it's static, if it's just like a JPEG that's going online, I'll use whatever tool I have. For me, that's going to be Excel. If it's going online and it needs to be interactive, Excel 365 kind of sucks. I don't like using it. So if interaction is necessary, and that's a big if, which could be a totally different webinar. If interaction is actually necessary, I would use something like Tableau because it just makes that whole process of putting it online so much easier.
All right, great. Here's a question that came in about when you have numerous graphs together that are similar, how do you handle access labels?
Sure. So if your graphs are all of the same nature, like let's say it's ages for like 10 different groups, you need to have the same scale and you'd probably only need to have the axis label once, or maybe it's even in the title on the page, so you don't even have to have an axis label. But the scales themselves would need to be the same if the nature of the data is the same. If the nature of the data is going to vary, then you are welcome to change your scales up so that it fits the data that you're trying to show. For example, I was recently working with a group that was talking about health status in their community on a bunch of different metrics. And they had cancer rates in one graph, and then they had something like, I don't know, sepsis or something, a different graph. And the scales should not at all be similar because they had so much cancer. But sepsis happened so infrequently that if we put those on the same scale, you wouldn't even really be able to see what's happening in the data. So changing the scale up to tell the story that you think is the most correct and honest to what you know about your data can be the right thing to do.
That's really helpful. Here's a question that came in about use of color. And do you have any recommendations for maybe going away from the standard default of blue and pink when you're presenting data about men and women?
Yeah, let's never use the blue and pink. I'm a big fan of that idea. I think that's great. But what should you use instead? I would say go with your branding colors. There is no good reason to switch away from your branding colors to pick pink and blue just because you're talking about gender. That'd be quite a big leap. So just go with whatever your branding colors are.
That's great. I will definitely stop using pink and blue.
Thank you.
How about, could you talk a little bit about some of the biggest mistakes people make when they start graphing?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake is not having your insight. But we already talked about that one in quite a bit of detail. I think the next mistake I often see is that people jump straight to what's the best software, when the software, like all softwares, are going to have some drawbacks. There's always going to have to be some hacking and manipulation that you do. It doesn't matter what software you use. You're always going to have to do some kind of changes. But people always want to jump straight to that. They want to talk about what software should I get. Software is just a tool. It's the strategic thinking that you really need to have in place that helps you determine what the best chart types will be. Any tool should be able to get you there. I think another big mistake that people make is not thinking about who their audience is and like over designing when it isn't audience appropriate to do so.
Terrific. We had a question come in. What additional literature resources do you recommend for doctoral students who are just starting to learn data viz? It's such a hot topic for their generation. I bet you have some good recommendations that way.
Yeah, well, aside from my books, which I have to just promote for one more second because I saw earlier questions come in about citations. Yeah, because I keep talking about research says. It's all documented in the book. That's why I wrote the book, is so that you would have all of those those research available. And I will say this, data visualization is still a young field, so we might see some of these things evolve as we get more research conducted on these different topics. And as long as we stay in the loop about what those articles and those studies, then we'll continue to evolve as well. But aside from the work that I do, there is a very strong data viz community on Twitter. When we get to the end, I think my Twitter handle will be up there on the screen. But if you follow me and see the people that I retweet, those are going to be the people to follow. If you search on hashtag DataViz, you'll see a lot of people who are tweeting about these things. And it's a very welcoming community where you can ask questions and get feedback on your own works in progress. You can see other people's great examples and get inspired by those. So I would just say start to get plugged into that community because you're going to just be, it's like there's so many resources that are shared there, it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose.
All right. We had a question come in over Twitter, and I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So this question is, have you ever used Power BI to present, to work with any of your data viz projects?
Yes, and I have sworn it off since then. I personally do not think that it can do the things that I need it to do. I understand why people like it. I hear more and more and more people asking me about Power BI because it can be a free tool. And you got to work with the budget that you have. So I completely understand that. But it just doesn't like the structure used internally within Power BI is not consistent chart to chart, so it can be really confusing about what you're doing. And you cannot hack it the way that you can hack graphs in Excel or Tableau to get charts that are high impact but not default. Power BI does have a plugin store where you can buy a plugin like to make a dot plot, for example, but in practice, it doesn't usually work the way that it's anticipated to work, and doesn't necessarily work with all data. And it's just, Power BI is not there yet, and I'm not sure if it's going to be. Microsoft has started to promote another program that they developed called Charticulator. Yeah, quite a mouthful, Charticulator. I haven't explored it myself yet, but that's what Microsoft has been putting out as a data visualization platform. So my guess is that they're probably going to put more effort into that than Power BI. But, I don't work there, so I can't say for sure.
All right, last question for you. And we have so many researchers and practitioners in our audience today. I'm sure many people have a similar question. Your advice for people who are working inside a company or working with an organization, trying to make a lot of people happy with one set of graphs. Any recommendations that way?
You're always going to make people unhappy with, like, the idea that one size fits all just does not ever really work. Everybody's got different questions and different things that they need. So I would just get used to making different graphs. I think that's just the nature of the game. Like, the charts we make to go into our research articles are not the same charts that the CEO wants to see, which are not the same charts that the public wants to see. So I think that we will break ourselves if we try to make a one size fits all. I've seen lots of folks who try to make one dashboard that has everybody's metrics on it, and then there are like 50 metrics in the dashboard, and it's overwhelming and way too intense for anybody to use, when really the people that they're trying to reach here are in maybe 4 main buckets, and the people in those buckets have similar questions. And once we know what their questions are, then we can figure out the metrics that we need to put on their dashboard. And that might mean 4 different dashboards, one for each bucket of people.
Well, thank you so much for fielding all those questions and for all our audience's great questions. Just really excited that we were able to share Dr. Evergreen with all of you today. And before we sign off, we just wanted to touch on a few things. We have an exciting contest and also wanted to share our discount code with you. So Stephanie wants to see your heart charts. We had a heart theme today, and our contest is asking you to create a chart that incorporates hearts. You need to use a chart or graph software or app. You'll want to post your heart chart with the hashtag heart chart to Twitter and email your entry. And you can see the email address for Danielle Wynn at sagepub.com. Online, we will be following up with all this information to you too. Following the webinar, we'll be sending everyone who signed up today an email that has all of this information into it. Our deadline for the contest entry is February 7th. We're going to be selecting 3 winners via a random drawing, and all of those winners will receive free copies of Dr. Evergreen's books. Given our heart chart theme, winners will be announced on Valentine's Day. So this will be a fun contest, a great way to show off your work. Stephanie has done a really nice job of giving you some examples here. Again, you want to make sure that you include those hearts. And we will, of course, share our winners on Valentine's Day. We hope you enter. Lots of fun. And then finally, before we sign off, for those of you interested in purchasing copies of Stephanie's books, we do have a promotion code here. Just use SAGE 2020 for a 20% discount on these titles when you visit us on our website at www.sagepub.com, and that discount code is valid through the 21st of February. So you can enjoy, you have plenty of time to make your purchase. And just wanted to give a big thank you to Stephanie today. That was such a tremendous webinar, such great information. So we're very grateful that you've joined us today, Stephanie. And thank you everybody for also coming online with us today In the coming days, please be on the lookout for a recording of this webinar. It'll include all of Stephanie's great slides and examples. And in the meantime, we hope you'll enter our Heart Chart contest. Thank you all and have a terrific day.